I am here for the Aren't You Glad You're Sewing retreat in Timmins, Ontario with Vanessa Genier of Quilts for Survivors. And right now I'm going to give a little demo of the few key techniques in the pattern giveaway. So stay tuned, we're going to have some fun. First technique we're going to do is a gigantic half square triangle. We're going to be cutting 9-inch squares of fabric in 2 colors, and we're going to draw a line down the middle of the lighter square, and with right sides together we're going to sew a 1/4-inch seam allowance on each side of that drawn line. So the fabrics will be together, right sides, and we're going to cut on that drawn line after we stitch to create 2 half square triangles. So let's get started with the giant HST. So first things first, we need a 9-inch square of 2 different colors of fabric. So we've got orange and blue here, and we're going to put them right sides together. The tools we need are a long ruler so that we can draw our line across, and we need a pencil. I suggest you use a soft leaded pencil so it leaves a nice line. So we've got 2 9.5-inch squares, we've got a long ruler and a pencil. We'll also need a square ruler to square up our HST when we're done. This one works really perfectly because it's an 8.5-inch square. You can use a bigger ruler, but this really squares up our HST to the exact size that we need it. So first things first, we're going to take the lighter fabric of the 2, just so that we can see our pencil line. On the wrong side of the fabric, we're going to go corner to corner with our ruler. You want to make sure you can see those points on either end, and we're going to take our pencil and draw a line. And it doesn't need to be that dark. Let's see if it's dark enough. Yeah, you can see that line perfectly. Now we're going to match these 2 pieces up perfectly, right sides together. Just make sure all those edges line up all the way around. Then we're going to take it over to the machine. We're going to sew a 1/4-inch seam allowance on either side of this pencil line. I'm going to go do that now, and I'll be right back. So here it is, all sewn together. So I've sewn a 1/4-inch seam allowance on either side of my pencil line. Here's a close-up view. The next step is to take a ruler, bring it over to your cutting table, and cut right on that pencil line. I'm going to go do that, and I'll be right back. Here they are, all stitched together. You can see I have 2 HSTs now. We can open it up. So we see the right sides, and then I would generally press light to dark. The next step is to square it up. So we'll take it over to the cutting table, but let me show you how we'll do that. So we're going to be taking a ruler with a line, diagonal line, and we're going to be using that line on here, and we're just going to be trimming a little bit of these edges off to make it a perfect 8.5-inch square. You can see that 9-inch square got smaller because we pieced it together, so there's just a very little bit to trim on each side. I'll go trim it, and I'll be right back. Here it is, all finished. Now, a good little side tip to know is when you're sewing that 1/4-inch seam allowance to get started on either side of your pencil line, it's good to have either a scant 1/4-inch or a perfect 1/4-inch. If your 1/4-inch is too big, your end block might end up being smaller than 8.5-inch square, and you will have just a block that's too small. It's better to have a scant 1/4-inch when you're stitching, then your block might be a little too big, and you can square it down with that nice 8.5-inch ruler. So there you have it, giant 8.5-inch square, half square triangles. Next up, we're going to do this little 4-patch unit. So we are going to be sewing 4 4.5-inch squares together. So we'll be sewing a top to bottom, and then left to right. So we're going to have 1, 2, 3 seams. The last seam is going to be a vertical seam. And the reason we want our little 4 patches to end with a vertical seam is because if you go over to the next page and you're sewing your rows together, it's nice to have those vertical seams all the way through so that we can press one row all the way to the right, and then the next row we can press all the way to the left. So we're alternating the way that we press, so all these little seams nest up nicely. So let's get started with our 4-patch unit. Okay, so we have 4 pieces of fabric in 2 colors. They're 4.5 inches square, and we're gonna sew 1 seam, 2 seams, 3 seams. So let's go to the machine. Here we have our finished stitched components of the block. A general rule of thumb is to press light to dark. So I'm going orange to blue. So we have 1 more seam to sew and the block will be complete. And one more little tip, if you're pressing light to dark and light to dark and they're opposite, you can nest the seams. So when you go to put these together to sew the vertical seam, you can take these seams and the little fold, they just get nested together. Can you see how they just butt up against each other? So they're nicely nested, no pinning whatsoever. Then you just lay them out on your machine with those seams nested and you stitch top to bottom. So here's your little 4-patch unit, nicely finished. Now you want to measure this to 8.5 inches, and if you're finding that it's slightly too small, that's when you want to change those seam allowances to use a scant seam allowance, so your block ends up being a little bit bigger, and you want them to be exactly 8.5 inches. So those are the 2 lessons we learned today. We've got a giant HST that's 8.5 inch square, and we've got a 4-patch unit, and we had a lot of fun. Hopefully you learned something. And these are the components of the Cedar quilt for the Orange You Glad Your Sewing Retreat with Vanessa Genier and Quilts for Survivors.